Hey everyone, in this video we're going to teach you everything you need to know about Blender's timeline. Just go ahead and drag this bad boy out a little bit so you can actually see what you're doing. Now the timeline gives you a broad overview of your animation by showing you the keyframes of active objects or your controller or your controllers. It also shows you the beginning and end frame of your animation sequence and any markers set by you. So to explain the tools offered in the timeline editor, we're going to create a simple bouncing ball animation as we go. However, since this video is meant for both beginner and advanced animators who want to learn how to use Blender as a software, we're not gonna focus too much on the step-by-step process of animating the ball. We're going to leave the animation part of it to an actual video dedicated to a bouncing ball. In this video, we're simply just going to use the animation to have a visual guide just so we can better explain the timeline editor. So when you first open Blender, again, the timeline is a little bit hidden when you go to the animation tab. You just got to tickle it out, bring it out a little bit, and you want to make sure that the auto key button, this beautiful full circle here, you want to make sure that's on. Now, if you're newer, I suggest leaving this on because it sets a key every time you move an object, so you don't have to manually set a key. But if you're not an auto keyer person, then you can just leave that off. But I'm going to leave mine on because I have converted into an auto keyer person. Yeah, I had a few traumatic situations where I didn't have auto keyer on, and I made this really nice pose. I moved all my controllers around. So this is what happens. Let's say I want the ball to be here, and I move my key and it snaps back because we didn't set any keys because the auto keyer wasn't on. So it goes back to the previous key that we had set. That happened to me a few times, and so I became an auto keyer. Alright, so let's make sure our ball is in pose mode. And if you remember our last video, you can just press Ctrl Tab to switch between pose and object mode. Now let's press A to select all of our controllers, and now we can press I and come all the way down to whole character selected bones only, which is what I like using. All this means is that it sets a key on all of the selected bones. So I'm going to press and click that. And if you want to avoid doing this and choosing an option every time you press I, you can head over to keying, and over here in the active keying set, you can type in, I'm going to type in whole, and it's right there. Whole character selected bones. Now when you set this, every time you press I, it automatically chooses this option for you. So it's one less click every single time you set a key. You're welcome. Now if you're a person who likes to differentiate between your breakdowns, your key poses, your moving holds and whatnot, you can actually do that by going to the new keyframe type, open this up, and you got keyframe, breakdown, moving hold, extreme jitter. And what this does is that you set the default. So for example, if I change this to jitter and I go to frame 20, I select this and I move it and I set a key by pressing I. Now notice that the menu didn't show up anymore, it set a key, and now our key is jitter, it's green. And I'm gonna go ahead and change that back because I don't like jitter. Go back to keyframe, and now we're like, oh crap, so one of my keys is green now and one is yellow. What do? How do I don't want this, I want to go back. You can select all of them or just one. Let's say we want both. And now while your cursor is in the timeline, you can press R and this menu comes up and you can switch it to whichever one you like. So let's say keyframe, and now they're both keyframe. This is super useful if you want to know where your key poses are. So for example, let's say we have two key poses, 0 and 30, or 1 and 30, and on frame 15, we want to have an in-between. So I'm going to press I, and I'm going to select this in-between and press R. Now I can change this into breakdown. And now this button looks different than these two. And that way I know which one's the breakdown, which one's the key pose when I'm animating. All right, I think it's time to start adding some keyframes. With my cursor in the viewport, I'm gonna press A. So everything is selected. Let me just delete all of these down here. Press the delete button. Go to frame 1. All right, so I'm gonna use this controller right here. On frame 1, I'm gonna come all the way up here. Now, oh, auto key isn't on. Let's turn that on. So I don't bring up past trauma again. Now I'm gonna press I to set a key. Now let's go to frame, let's say 12, and bring the ball back down. Now there's two things you can do. You can try and eyeball it if you want, or let's press N and open up our channel box. You can either zero it out this way, or you can press Alt G, which resets the translates. If you guys remember from our previous videos, Alt G resets the translates, Alt R resets our rotations, Alt S resets our scale. So now we're back to 0 on the ball. So now we have one pose up top and the next pose down here. Now let's go ahead and find our final pose, which will be in frame 14. So I'm going to, in the timeline, copy frame 1 because we want it to be the exact same as frame 1. Control C, and make sure we are on the frame that we want to actually paste. And I'm gonna press Control V, and there we go. Now we have this right here. Now as you guys can see, it's very spliny. We're gonna address that. But one thing we need to do first is actually shorten our timeline, because right now this is what happens. It plays once and then, you know, we go all the way to frame 250. You can come over here at end and change end to 23. Now, the reason and how I focused on the keys right there is by pressing the number pad, selecting all of them, I'm pressing numpad to focus. Now, the reason we went to 23 frames instead of where our key is 24 is because frame 24 and frame 1 are the exact same pose. If we have the exact same pose playing, then that looks like the ball is actually sticking, which means you're seeing the ball in the same position in 2 frames. So you would see it in this position in frame 24, and you would see it in the exact same place once the animation loops. This way, the animation ends at frame 23, and so the following frame is the ball's final pose, which then becomes its beginning pose. If you're newer to animation, that will make a lot more sense as we go on, don't worry. For all you veterans, I'm sorry you had to listen to that. All right, now that we have our 3 keys, you can either, using the scroll on your mouse, the middle mouse button, you can scroll out, scroll in of your timeline. You can hold down the middle mouse to actually pan around. Don't pan up because then your keyframes disappear. You gotta make sure you don't do that. So pan sideways, but be careful. You can also hold Control and middle mouse to expand and retract your timeline. Again, there's like 100 different ways of doing everything with Blender, so you can find the way you're most comfortable. And a couple more things, you can switch frames, which I wish Maya did this. You can switch frames with the arrow keys on your keypad. You can go back and forth on your different frames, or you can press the up and down arrows to go in between your keyframes and not just the frames. So you can go in between keys by going up and down. You can, with left and right, you go frame by frame. Now if you want to play, you can just press space. Again, I wish Maya did this. You can just press space and play. You can press space to pause. And I'm sure you guys have figured it out. The vertical blue line is where the current frame is at. So this is how you know which frame you're on. And if you guys take a look at up here, you can see the FPS that the animation is playing at. It's a little all over the place. And right now the scene is very light. And since it only contains one simple rig, we're able to see pretty much all 24 frames per second. However, animation scenes usually contain heavy sets and complex rigs, and that usually slows down your work significantly. To make sure that your animation is playing in real time, instead of slowing down on some frames, you can head over to playback, and in sync, instead of play every frame, you can change this to frame dropping. Now this way Blender will skip displaying some frames to maintain an accurate timing of your animation. Now if you have audio in your scene, you can change this from frame dropping to sync to audio. This way it matches your animation with the audio you've put in. So there's no mismatch between the audio and visual. But if you don't, you can just leave it at frame dropping. This way you can always make sure that it's showing you what the realistic timing of your animation would look like. Depending on how heavy the scene is, it might be missing a few frames. The best thing you can do is just play blast, but we'll cover that later. Alright, so let me bring this bad boy up a little bit. So as you guys can see, we have the dope sheet open right now, and I want to see the graph editor. What you can do is go here and choose the graph editor, or press Shift F6. Or what I've grown to do is when I select the animation tab and I see the dope sheet, I can just press Control Tab, and that switches it to the graph editor. If I press it again, back to dope sheet, Control Tab, graph editor. It's just like switching from object mode to pose mode in the viewport. When you have your cursor on the graph editor, you go switch from graph editor to dope sheet. Do I dare try it here? Oh, I guess that goes to graph editor too. You learn something new every day. Okay, so let's take a look at our translate Y. I'm going to select everything. I guess it selects everything. We'll talk about graph editors later, but let's focus and let's play this. So when playing the animation, we can see that the ball is easing in and easing out of frame 12, which means that the interpolation is set to Bezier. This is what I'm talking about. Right now we're in Bezier, and this is the same thing as auto in Maya, for those that are familiar with that. Now let's go to frame 12, where the ball actually hits the ground, and we are going to press V on our keyboard, and we are going to change this to vector. This gives us a nice pointy curve, and as you guys can see, a much sharper bounce. And if you guys must know, you can actually change the interpolation and handle type on any key. So I could change the interpolation of this to constant, which is stepped mode. So it holds the same pose until it reaches another key. Or I can go over here and change the handle to vector, to automatic, and you can affect every single key separately. So let's Control Z this. I'm not sure if I already mentioned this, but constant is essentially stepped mode in Maya. And linear is linear, Bezier is automatic. Now, if you find that the animation is playing too slow or too fast, let's say, we can go to frame 1, and let's select all of our keyframes by drag selecting. Now, while my cursor is on the timeline, I'm going to press S for scale. And now by moving my cursor to the right and left, I can scale up and down. And so the farther right I go, the longer this will take. So now our final keyframe is on frame 31, which is a second and a half. 24 frames is 1 second. 31 is about a second and a half. I'm gonna press S again, and I'm gonna bring it in. So now our entire animation takes place in half a second, in 12 frames. Another cool thing you can do with scale is, let's say we go back to 24. And here I can press S. Then I can say 0.5 and enter. I don't know if you caught that, but we just cut our amount of keyframes by half. And so we told it scale down to half the size you were before. So now if we press S and then we type in 2, that multiplies it by 2. If you press S and say 1.5, so 1.5, and it multiplied it by times 1.5. And that is super, super helpful because of many reasons. But an example that I can share that happened to me is that for some forsaken reason, my frame rate was set to 60 in a file, and I had done a lot of animation without realizing this. I have my reasons for not realizing, okay, but I didn't realize this, and my animation was at 60 FPS. And so I was devastated, panicking, okay, how do I fix this? Do I have to reanimate? Do I just press S and like hope for the best, scale it visually? And Vlad, the technical director at 2Animate, he told me that I can just press S and multiply by, let's say, 0.25, a quarter. And that was it. That's all I had to do. That pretty much fixed my problem. I just did the math and I gave it a multiplication, and that fixed my problem. And I went back down to 24 frames and there was no problems. So this thing can come in super, super handy. And if you want to move your frames around, you can just drag select or just click on a single one. Press G for move. And there you go. You just grab them and you can move your keys. Or you can just select a single one, press G, move it around. You can even click and hold as well. If you can select multiple, click and hold. Lots of ways to do things with Blender. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about in this video. I want to mention what markers are and how you can set them. So let's go to frame 13, and no particular reason, but while with my cursor in the timeline, I'm going to press M. And now we have a marker that was created here. Let's open up our timeline a little bit more, just because that takes up a bit of space. Now that we have a marker, we can go to the marker tab here, and we can rename this if we like. So let's say this is hits ground. And so now that we have this marker, we know that at this time, the ball hits the ground. These things are super useful because you can mark a specific frame of your animation like we just did. It could be for any reason. It could be for, you know, us letting our future self know that this is the frame that the ball hits the ground. Or if you want to add effects later on a certain frame, you don't have to memorize it. You can just make a marker for it and name it. Or if you want to communicate that the camera angle or focal length changes on a specific frame or anything else, it's there to serve you as a visual aid, so you don't have to remember the keyframe number. Now, if you want to get rid of it, make sure your cursor is down here, not on the timeline, down where the marker is, and press X. And now it says, do you want to delete marker? I say yes, and that's gone. So that's about it. Now you should be an expert in all things timeline and ready to explore other editors in Blender. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.